In this episode, we are looking at a vulnerability that sounds narrow at first, but actually teaches a much bigger lesson about trust, boundaries, and how software should handle access to files. Directory traversal vulnerabilities show up when an application gives a user some influence over what file or location it will access, but does not limit that choice carefully enough. For a brand new learner, this matters because many systems rely on file paths behind the scenes for images, documents, reports, templates, logs, and other resources that make the application work. If the application allows a request to move outside the intended folder or area, an attacker may be able to reach files that were never supposed to be exposed. That does not always mean the attacker gets total control of the server, but it can still lead to sensitive information disclosure, deeper compromise, and a very serious security problem. Once you understand why applications should stay within certain boundaries when they access files, directory traversal becomes much easier to recognize and much easier to connect to real-world risk. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. At the core of this issue is a very simple idea. Computers organize files into folders and subfolders so that systems can find what they need in an orderly way. An application may be designed to let users retrieve a file from one safe location, such as a downloads folder, an image directory, or a section that stores public documents. The problem begins when the application accepts user-controlled input that helps build the file path, but fails to make sure that path stays inside the safe area it was meant to use. Instead of keeping the request limited to one approved location, the application may allow the request to climb up and out of the expected directory. That is why the word traversal matters. The attacker is not creating a magical new path out of nowhere. They are taking advantage of the way file systems are structured and persuading the application to walk through those structures in a way the developer never intended. To make sense of that, it helps to picture a building with many rooms and storage areas. An employee may be allowed into the mailroom because that is where public handouts are kept, but not into the finance archive, the executive filing room, or the records closet. A directory traversal flaw is similar to giving someone a request slip for the mailroom and accidentally allowing them to scribble extra directions on it that tell the staff to walk past the mailroom and keep going into restricted areas. The staff member still believes they are handling a normal request, but the path instructions have been manipulated in a dangerous way. That is why this vulnerability is not just about files. It is about access control and whether the application properly separates intended user choice from protected internal structure. When those boundaries are weak, the software may do exactly what it was told to do, yet still violate the organization's security expectations in a major way. Many applications interact with files more often than beginners realize. A website may need to retrieve profile pictures, display downloadable forms, serve product images, load documents, generate reports, or read configuration data during normal operation. In some cases, the application may accept a file name or a related parameter from the user and then use that value to locate the resource. That can be perfectly reasonable if the program handles it safely. The danger appears when the application treats that user-supplied value too literally and trusts it as part of the full path. If a request says to retrieve a file from a public folder, the application should not quietly allow the same request to wander into system folders, secret storage areas, or internal records. This is why directory traversal is often described as a path handling problem. The application is supposed to serve one approved area, but unsafe handling allows movement beyond the approved boundary into places that should remain off-limits. One of the key ideas beginners need to understand is that the application may not realize anything is wrong. From its point of view, it may simply be reading a path and trying to open a file. If the application logic does not validate that path properly, it may accept extra path navigation elements that move upward through the directory structure before going back down into another location. The attacker is not necessarily bypassing the system through brute force or malware at this stage. They are taking advantage of how the application interprets the path. This makes the flaw especially important because it often feels like normal functionality being used in an abnormal way. The software still thinks it is serving a file request. The real mistake is that it allowed the request to describe a route that should never have been accepted. For analysts, that means these vulnerabilities are often about flawed assumptions in application design rather than dramatic signs of system failure. The impact of a directory traversal vulnerability depends on what files become reachable once the boundary is broken. In some cases, the attacker may only be able to view harmless files, which is still a weakness but may have limited practical damage. In other cases, the reachable files may include configuration details, user records, internal documents, credentials stored in plain form, cache data, or logs containing valuable information about the environment. Even when the first exposed file does not seem critical, the information inside it can help the attacker learn more about the system, identify valuable targets, and plan further abuse. A single exposed configuration file, for example, might reveal database locations, service relationships, usernames, or secrets that lead to larger compromise. This is one reason security analysts should avoid treating information disclosure as minor by default. The first leaked file may only be a foothold, but footholds matter because they reduce uncertainty for the attacker and make the next step easier. It is also useful to understand that directory traversal is often associated with reading files, but the broader risk can extend beyond simple viewing depending on how the vulnerable feature works. If the affected functionality supports uploads, template handling, report generation, backup restoration, or other file-related actions, unsafe path control may influence more than one kind of behavior. The exact consequences depend on the permissions of the application and the design of the surrounding environment. A service that runs with broad access to internal files can turn a seemingly modest flaw into a major exposure. By contrast, a tightly constrained service with narrow file access may reduce the damage even if the flaw exists. This is where application security and system architecture meet. Vulnerabilities do not exist in a vacuum. The same flaw can be far more serious in one environment than another because privilege, segmentation, service design, and stored data all shape the real-world impact. A common beginner misconception is that directory traversal only matters in old-fashioned websites serving static files. In reality, the concept appears anywhere software takes some kind of input and uses it to locate resources and storage. Modern applications may hide the file system behind layers of frameworks, cloud storage, content handling, or internal service logic, yet the basic risk can still appear if path handling is careless. Another misconception is that this vulnerability is always obvious because the file names or requests look suspicious. Some cases are noisy, but others are subtle and blend into normal traffic, especially if the application was already designed to accept file-related parameters from users. This is why defenders need to think beyond stereotypes. A polished modern application can still have a very ordinary trust boundary problem if it allows outside input to shape internal file access without strong controls. The issue is not whether the interface looks old or new. The issue is whether the user can influence storage access beyond what the business purpose actually requires. Directory traversal also teaches an important lesson about normalization and interpretation. A path may be expressed in more than one form, and software components do not always interpret the same input in exactly the same way. An application may try to block one obvious pattern but still fail because the path is encoded differently, combined with unexpected separators, or processed by another layer that resolves it after the initial check. Beginners do not need to memorize every variation to understand the principle. The real lesson is that weak filtering often fails when the deeper design still allows untrusted input to shape the path. If defenders rely only on spotting a few dangerous characters or sequences, they may create a false sense of safety while leaving the core weakness intact. Stronger protection comes from limiting what the application is allowed to access, reducing user control over direct path construction, and verifying that the final resolved path stays inside an approved location rather than merely checking how the original request looked on the surface. From the analyst perspective, one of the most important questions is what kind of information lives near the vulnerable function. If the application serves public images from a location that sits nowhere near sensitive content, the blast radius may be smaller. If that same application is on a server where sensitive configuration files, access secrets, backups, audit records, and private documents are all present within reach of the service account, the exposure becomes far more serious. Analysts should also think about who can reach the vulnerable feature. An internet-facing flaw available to any visitor deserves different urgency than one buried in a limited internal tool, though internal weaknesses still matter because insiders, compromised accounts, and lateral movement all exist in real environments. Good vulnerability analysis is about context. It is not enough to say directory traversal was found. The useful security question is what the flaw lets an attacker touch, what privileges the application holds, and how that access might contribute to additional compromise across the organization. Detection can be difficult because the requests involved may look like ordinary attempts to retrieve files, documents, or resources. Security teams may notice unusual path patterns, repeated requests for unexpected files, errors involving file access, or strange traffic against download and image endpoints. Web server logs, application logs, and file access monitoring can all provide clues, but visibility must be good enough to connect the behavior to the affected function. Sometimes the most important sign is not a dramatic crash, but a series of odd requests that suggest someone is probing the boundaries of the application. That is why mature monitoring looks for both abuse and reconnaissance. An attacker may test several harmless targets first to learn how the application handles file paths before trying to reach something more valuable. Analysts who understand the vulnerability are better prepared to interpret those signals, distinguish normal use from suspicious exploration, and recognize that repeated file-related anomalies can point to a meaningful attempt to escape intended directory boundaries. Prevention starts with the idea that users should not directly control file paths unless there is a very strong reason, and even then that control should be tightly restricted. A safer design often maps user choices to approved internal resources rather than accepting raw path instructions from the outside. Instead of letting a request describe where on the system to go, the application can choose from a limited set of known safe objects or identifiers. Strong validation also matters, but it should be focused on whether the final target is allowed, not only on whether the original input looked clean. Safe storage design helps as well. If publicly served files are separated from sensitive system content, and if the application has only the minimum permissions it needs, then even a mistake may reveal much less. This is a good example of defense in depth. Better coding, better file organization, stronger service restrictions, and thoughtful monitoring all work together to reduce the chance that one weak boundary becomes a serious incident. This vulnerability also connects closely to the broader principle of least privilege. If an application only needs access to one narrow content area, it should not also be able to read a wide range of operating system files, internal secrets, or unrelated business records. Restricting that access does not eliminate the underlying coding flaw, but it can drastically reduce the consequences of exploitation. The same thinking applies to system design choices, such as separating public content from administrative data, isolating sensitive services, and keeping secrets out of locations where lower trust processes can reach them. Analysts should notice that many high-impact vulnerabilities become far worse because systems are designed with excessive reach and convenience rather than strict boundaries. Directory traversal is a perfect illustration of that problem. A weak input control is dangerous by itself, but it becomes much more dangerous when paired with an overprivileged service and a file structure that places sensitive material within easy reach of the compromised path handling logic. By the end of this discussion, directory traversal should feel less like an obscure coding term and more like a very practical security lesson about boundaries, trust, and unintended access. The application is supposed to retrieve only the files that belong to the user's request within a safe and approved area, but poor path handling can allow movement into directories that were never meant to be exposed. Once that happens, the result may be sensitive information disclosure, better attacker reconnaissance, or a stepping stone toward deeper compromise, depending on what the application can access and how the environment is structured. That is why this topic matters for CySA Plus learners. It teaches you to look past the surface feature and ask whether user-controlled input can influence internal resources more than it should. When you learn to see that pattern clearly, you are not just learning one vulnerability name. You are learning how small trust mistakes in software can open doors to much larger security failures.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.